The wind came down off the bighorns that morning, the way it always did in late October. Slow at first, almost gentle, carrying the smell of pine smoke and something colder underneath it, something that didn't belong to autumn anymore. The grass along the river had already turned the color of old straw. The cottonwoods stood half bare, their leaves scraping the frozen mud like paper. A thin breath of frost hung over the water. It was the winter of 1887, and Elias Carver stood at the edge of the Powder River, just south of a little settlement called Bitter Hollow in the Wyoming Territory. He was 39 years old, a widower, a man with a quiet face and hands that had forgotten what soft work felt like. He carried a canvas sack across his shoulder, and inside that sack were 7 smooth river stones, each the size of a man's 2 fists pressed together. He set the sack down by his feet. He looked at the stones for a long moment. Then he looked at the empty stretch of ground behind him, a shallow rise of earth sheltered by a low limestone bluff, with the river curling around it like a protective arm, and he began to count. Not the stones in the sack, the stones still in the river. He counted them the way a man counts the days of his life when he knows the cold is coming. What Elias Carver was about to build, in the slow weeks before the first true storm, would be called madness by every man in the valley. They would laugh in the saloon. They would laugh in the church pew. They would laugh in the trading post and around the blacksmith's fire. By spring, his stone refuge would be the only thing in Bitter Hollow still standing. Word travels strange in a small frontier town. A man can buy flour without a word said, and by sundown the whole valley knows whether he paid in coin or in trade. So when Elias Carver began hauling river stones, not for a foundation, not for a chimney, but stacking them in slow, careful curves along the rise behind his half-finished cabin, the talk began before the second day was done. He had no walls yet, no roof, just a low ring of stones, knee-high, set without mortar, fitted by hand. From the road, it looked like a child's circle of toys. Henry Drummond, the blacksmith, was the first to say it out loud. He stood in the doorway of his forge with his leather apron singed black at the edges, watching Elias pass by with another sack of stones tied to the back of a borrowed mule. "Carver," he called out, friendly enough at first. "What in God's name are you doing with all that rock?" Elias stopped. He turned slow. He had a way of turning that made men feel their own questions were too loud. "Building a shelter," he said. "Out of riverstone?" "Out of riverstone." Drummond laughed. It was a short, surprised laugh, the kind that has no cruelty in it yet, only confusion. "Man, you'll freeze. Stone draws the cold. My forge here is brick, and even brick weeps in January. You ought to be cutting timber. There's still pine standing up at Miller's Draw." "I've thought on it," Elias said. And I'm laying stone." He clicked his tongue at the mule and walked on. Drummond watched him go, shook his head, and went back inside to the ring of his hammer. By the end of the week, the story had traveled. The preacher, a thin man named Reverend Josiah Bell, brought it up after Sunday service, not from the pulpit but on the front step, where the men gathered to talk weather and cattle, before they went home to their dinners. Bell was a kind man, but kindness in a preacher sometimes wears the shape of worry. "Brother Carver," he said gently, catching Elias by the sleeve as the small congregation thinned, "I hear you're stacking stones up by the bluff." "I am. For what purpose, if I may ask?" "A place to winter." The preacher's brow furrowed. "A man can't winter in cold rock, Elias. Not in this country. A stone house wants a great hearth, and a great hearth wants more wood than you can cut alone before the snow comes. You've a daughter to think of." At the mention of his daughter, Elias's jaw set, but he did not look away. "I've thought on her every stone I've laid," he said, "and every stone I've yet to lay." Bell nodded, slow and sad, and let the sleeve go. The third voice was the loudest. It belonged to a man named Coleman Pratt, who kept the saloon at the crossroads and considered himself the eyes and ears of Bitter Hollow. Coleman Pratt had never built a thing in his life that wasn't a card table, but he had opinions enough for 10 men. He took his opinions to the bar each night and dispensed them like watered whiskey. 700 stones. Pratt told the room one evening, leaning on his elbows. "That's what the boy down at the river told me. 700. Carver's counting them like a miser counts coins. He's gone soft in the head since his wife passed. A man builds a wall of rock with no mortar. What does he think will hold it up? Faith?" He grinned at the room. "Maybe the ghost of Sarah Carver will come down and hold his roof on for him." The men laughed. Some of them laughed loud. Some of them laughed only with their shoulders, because they remembered Sarah Carver and the sickness that took her 2 winters back. And they were not entirely cruel men. The laughter reached Elias, the way laughter always does in a small town. It came to him through the boy who delivered nails. It came to him through the woman at the trading post who weighed his salt with eyes that didn't quite meet his own. It came to him through the silence of the men who used to nod hello and now found other places to look. He did not answer the laughter. He went back to the river. His daughter Hannah, 11 years old that autumn, watched him from the doorway of their lean-to one cold afternoon. She had her mother's gray eyes and her mother's habit of asking questions only when the asking would not hurt. "Papa," she said, "are they right? About the stones?" Elias set down the sack. He knelt in front of her so their eyes were level, and he took both her small hands in his rough ones. "Hannah," he said, "stone holds the day's heat the way your mother used to hold a kettle. Slow, steady. Long after the fire's gone, there's wisdom older than this town, older than this country. I learned a piece of it from a Welshman in the mines at Rock Springs, and a piece of it from a Shoshone woman who taught your mother to bank a fire. The rest I'm learning as I lay each one. Will it be warm? It will be warm, Hannah. I promise you that. It will be warm when nothing else is." She studied his face the way a child studies a thing she desperately wants to believe. "Then let them laugh," she said. He kissed the top of her head. That night the temperature dropped 12 degrees between supper and sunrise, and the first real frost laid itself down over Bitter Hollow like a sheet pulled over a sleeping child. Up on the ridges, where no man bothered to look, the clouds began to gather in long iron-colored ranks, slow and patient, waiting their turn. The work began before light each morning and did not end until his hands could no longer feel the stones. Elias had chosen his spot with the care of a man who had lost too much already to choose poorly. The bluff behind the build was limestone, 10 feet high, curving in a shallow horseshoe that broke the worst of the north wind before it ever reached the ground. The river ran past at the bottom of the slope, 20 paces off, close enough to draw water, but far enough that a spring thaw would not undermine the foundation. The ground rose gently. Drainage would carry away the melt. He had seen the spot in summer and known it then. He had waited to begin only because the river stones had to come up while the water was still low. Each morning he led the mule down to a long gravel bar where the powder ran shallow over a bed of polished rock. He would wade in to his knees, and later, as the cold sharpened, to his shins, his ankles burning numb, and he would lift the stones one by one. He chose them by hand, not for size alone, for shape, for density, for the way they sat in his palm. The good ones were smooth on the outside but heavy at the core, river stones cured by 10,000 years of water. The kind of stone that the old Welsh miner had told him about over a tin cup of coffee back in '79. "You want a stone that drank the sun," the Welshman had said. "Not a stone that ran from it. Riverstone. Riverstone holds the heat like a wife holds a grudge, slow to take it in, slower still to let it go." Elias had been a young man then. He had laughed politely and forgotten the words for almost 10 years. But the words had not forgotten him. They had waited in some quiet shelf of his memory, the way wisdom waits in a man until he has need of it. And now, kneeling in a freezing river, lifting his 11th stone of the morning into a canvas sack, he understood. He hauled them up the slope 2 and 3 at a time, the mule walking ahead, breath steaming, hooves chipping the frozen mud. He stacked them along a curve he had marked out with twine and pegs, not a square, not a rectangle, but a long oval, like the shape of an egg laid on its side. The flat end faced south, into the winter sun. The narrow end faced north, into the wind. The shape was not his own invention. He had seen its like once, years before, on a cattle drive that took him up through the southern edge of the Crow country. An old man there, half crow and half trapper, had pointed at a low mound of fitted stone half sunk into a hillside. "Winter house," the old man had said. "Built by people gone before my grandfather's grandfather. Stone takes the sun in the day, gives it back at night. The wind goes around. The cold cannot find the corners, because there are no corners. No corners." That was the secret. A square fights the wind. A curve invites it past. Elias laid his stones without mortar, not because he could not have made mortar, but because the gaps were part of the design. Each stone fitted to the next by weight and shape, the small ones filling the spaces between the large, locked by gravity and friendship. He worked the way a man works a puzzle that has only one solution. Lift, turn, settle, test, lift again, turn again, settle again. The wall rose slow, knee-high by the end of the first week, hip-high by the end of the second. His back ached at night in a way that reminded him he was no longer the man who had ridden the Bozeman Trail at 22. His hands cracked along the knuckles. The cold split them, and the river water salted them, and Hannah took to rubbing them each evening with rendered bear fat she warmed by the lean-to fire. She did not speak while she did it. She had her mother's quiet. The dog, an old shepherd named Cassie, kept him company at the build. She lay on the south side of the rising wall, in whatever patch of sun could be found, and she did not bark at the men who sometimes rode by to look. She only watched them go and then put her head back down on her paws. By the end of the third week, the wall was as tall as a standing man's chest. By the end of the fourth, it was over his head. He left two openings. A low door on the south side, no taller than a stooped man, framed with 3 thick slabs of cottonwood he had cured the summer before, and a small hole near the top of the curve at the north end. A chimney, only 6 inches across, lined with a clay collar he had fired himself in a pit by the river. A small hole, he knew, kept heat. A large hole let it run for the roof. He did the thing the town would laugh at hardest. When word of it spread, he did not use timber, or rather, he used only enough timber to make a low frame of curved cottonwood ribs, lashed together at the top, and over that frame he laid a thick blanket of cut sod, grass side down, then a second layer, grass side up, then a foot of dry pine needles, then a third layer of sod over all of it. The roof, when it was done, was nearly 2 feet thick. It looked, from a distance, like a small green hill that had grown overnight beside the bluff. It looked, men said in town, like a grave. He's building his own tomb, Coleman Pratt told the saloon. Stone walls and a sod roof. I've seen prairie dogs with better sense, but up at the bluff, Elias was not building a tomb. He was building a thing he had heard called, once, a long time ago, by a name he liked very much, a heat keeper. Inside the curve of the wall, he laid a floor of flat river slate, fitted close, and beneath the slate he dug a shallow trench that ran from the door to a small hearth on the north wall. The trench he filled with more river stones, the smallest ones, the rejected ones, the ones not quite the right shape for the wall, and over the trench he laid his slate floor. The hearth itself was a low arch of stone, vented to the chimney, set so that the heat of a small fire would not roar straight up the flue, but would first crawl along the trench beneath the floor, warming the stones, warming the slate, warming the very ground a child might lie upon. He had read of such a thing in a missionary's letter, passed around at the trading post the summer before. A letter that described how the Koreans, halfway around the world, had warmed their houses for 1,000 years with a system they called by a name he could not pronounce. Heated floors. Stone beneath the feet. No need for a great roaring blaze. A small, steady fire could warm a whole room through the bones of the building. Stone, earth, a small fire, a round shape. No corners for the cold to bite. It was older than the town, older than the territory, older perhaps than the country itself. It was the kind of wisdom that does not come down from books but from the long, patient memory of people who once had no choice but to live through winters worse than any bitter hollow had ever seen. Hannah brought him cornbread at noon each day. She would sit on a stump at the edge of the build and chew slow, watching the wall rise, watching her father's silhouette against the pale gray sky. Sometimes she would speak, sometimes she would not. One afternoon she said, very softly, "Mama would have liked the shape." Elias did not turn around. He laid the stone in his hand into its place. He pressed it down. He felt it settle. "Yes," he said. "Your mama liked round things. She said square corners were for sorrow." Hannah nodded as if this was something she had always known. The work went on. By the first week of November, Elias Carver had moved 743 stones up from the river. He knew the number exactly because Hannah kept a tally on the inside of the lean-to door with a charred stick. He had built a wall 1.5 feet thick at the base, tapering to 10 inches at the top, sealed with a packed clay slurry on the inside face only. He had laid a slate floor over a stone-bedded heat trench. He had roofed it all with sod. He had hung a heavy cowhide across the inside of the low door, with a second oilcloth curtain behind it, an airlock his Welshman had told him about long ago. And on the 8th of November he lit his first small fire on the hearth, no bigger than a man's hat. And he and Hannah and the old shepherd Cassie sat on the slate floor and ate cornbread and beans, and Hannah laid her hand flat on the warm stone beside her, and laughed for the first time since her mother had died. "Papa," she said, "the floor is breathing. It's keeping," he said. "It's keeping the heat." He did not know yet what was already moving down out of the north, but what Elias Carver did not know, what no man in Bitter Hollow knew, on that quiet evening of the 8th of November in the year 1887, was that 900 miles north, over the long bare prairies of the Canadian border. The sky had already turned the color of cold iron, and a wind was building that would not stop for 16 days. It came on the 11th of November, a Friday, just before noon. The morning had been bright, almost warm. One of those false thaws that the prairie sometimes lays down in early winter like a piece of bait. Men in Bitter Hollow had been out repairing fences, hauling the last of the firewood, telling each other the worst was a month off yet. Coleman Pratt had even propped open the door of the saloon to let the sun in. Then, at 20 minutes past 11, the light changed. It was not gradual. It was not the slow gray of an ordinary storm rolling in. It was a snapping change, the way a candle goes out. The sun, which had been a clean white disk above the bluffs, dimmed to a copper coin and then to nothing. The temperature, which a freighter on the North Road later swore had been a mild 38 degrees, fell 40 degrees in less than an hour. Then the wind hit. It hit the town the way a horse kicks a barn door. The first gust took the door off the schoolhouse and threw it 20 feet into a wagon rut. The second tore the new sign down off Coleman Pratt's saloon. The third drove the snow into Bitter Hollow on a horizontal line, so thick and so fine that a man standing in the street could not see his own boots. And then the snow did not stop. It came down for 3 days without easing. It came down with a wind that did not pause. It came down so hard and so steady that men in cabins on the lower flats heard their roof beams groan and then crack under the weight, and women clutched their children and prayed in voices the children had never heard them use before. On the second day, the roof of the schoolhouse fell in. The schoolteacher, a young woman named Miss Abbott, had thank God already taken the children home. The bell, the heavy iron bell that the town had paid $40 for in '85, was buried so deep in the rubble that it would not be found until April. On the third day, the livery stable collapsed. 6 horses died inside. 2 of them belonged to Henry Drummond, the blacksmith. On the 4th day, Coleman Pratt's saloon began to lean, not all at once, slow. The west wall, which faced the wind, simply gave up its plumb. The frame timbers groaned and pulled at their nails. Pratt himself, who had been drinking steadily since the second day, for warmth and for courage, woke in the gray dark to find his own bottles sliding off the shelves. He ran into the street in his stocking feet and stood in snow up to his waist, and watched the building he had spent 10 years building tilt slowly westward and settle, with a sound like a tired old man sitting down in a chair, into a heap of broken pine. The cold inside the houses was worse than the cold outside. Cabins built of green pine, raised in haste during the boom years, leaked at every joint. Men nailed flour sacks over the inside of their windows. Women hung quilts on the inside of doors. They burned chair legs. They burned table legs. By the 5th day, 3 families in the lower flats were burning the pages of old catalogs in their stoves, 1 page at a time, for the few seconds of light and the illusion of warmth. Henry Drummond, the blacksmith, lost 2 fingers off his left hand to frostbite trying to feed his last horse. He did not know they were lost until the swelling went down on the 8th day, and by then it did not matter. Reverend Bell's wife, Eliza, came down with a fever on the 4th night, and was dead by the 7th morning. The ground was too frozen to bury her. They wrapped her in 2 blankets and laid her in the cold pantry behind the parsonage, and the Reverend Bell sat by the kitchen stove with his Bible open on his lap, and did not read a word of it for 2 days. Up at the bluff, behind the curve of limestone, beside the iced-over Powder River, the stone refuge did not move. The wind came down off the ridge and curved around the dome of sod, and stoned the way a river curves around a boulder. There were no corners to catch it. There was no flat wall to fight it. The wind went past and did not find the door, because the door was set into the south face, in the lee, where the bluff itself broke the worst of it. The snow piled up against the north side of the dome, and did not bury the chimney, because the chimney was set on the highest point of the curve, where the wind kept it scoured clear. Inside, the slate floor was warm, not hot, warm, the kind of warm that a cat seeks out, the kind of warm a child can sleep on. Elias kept a small fire going day and night, no bigger than a loaf of bread, fed with split pine he had cured all summer in a stack against the bluff. The fire crept along the heat trench. The stones beneath the slate held the heat. The slate gave it back, slow, up into the room. The room itself was small, 12 feet by 15. A low ceiling of sod that gave the air the smell of grass and damp earth and wood smoke, layered together, the way a barn smells in a deep winter when the cows are inside. There was room for a sleeping pallet for Hannah against the south wall, where the slate was warmest. There was room for Elias's own bedroll along the east curve. There was room for Cassie the shepherd to lie in front of the hearth, her belly to the warm stone, her old grayed muzzle resting on her paws. There was room for nothing else, and they needed nothing else. On the third morning of the storm, Elias opened the inner oilcloth and lifted the cowhide and pushed his shoulder against the door. The door moved 6 inches and stopped. Snow, hard packed by the wind, sealed the opening. He stood there in the small wedge of howling cold that came in through the gap, and he listened to the wind that he could not see, and for the first time in 2 months, doubt rose up in him like cold water. He thought of Sarah. He thought of how she had looked at him that last evening before the fever took her, and made him promise that Hannah would live. He thought of the men in town who had laughed. He thought of his hands, which had laid 743 stones, and which were now too stiff to fully close. What if he had missed one? What if there was one gap, one place where the cold could find its way in? What if the sod above their heads, soaked now and frozen solid, was heavier than he had calculated? What if the cottonwood ribs gave way in the night, and he and Hannah and Cassie were buried under their own roof, and no one would find them until spring? The doubt sat on his chest for a long minute. Then Hannah, behind him, said quietly, "Papa, the floor is still warm." He let the cowhide fall back into place. He turned. The fire was low but steady. The slate beneath his daughter's bare feet glowed faintly in the firelight from the heat it had stored through the night. Cassie had not moved. The little iron kettle on the hearth was beginning to sing. He sat down beside his daughter. "Yes," he said, "it is." The storm went on. 3 days became 5. 5 became 8. The wind did not stop. The snow did not stop. Somewhere out in the great whiteness, men and women and children were dying. Somewhere out there, the town of Bitter Hollow was being slowly broken into kindling by a storm that would, in the newspapers of Cheyenne and Denver 2 months later, be called the worst blizzard in the recorded history of the Wyoming territory. In the small, warm dome of stone, Elias Carver read aloud from a thin book of Psalms by the light of a tallow candle, and his daughter listened, and the dogs snored softly by the hearth, and the slate beneath their feet kept on giving back, hour after hour, the gentle stored heat of a fire no bigger than a loaf of bread. On the 9th night, after the wind had finally fallen and the world outside had gone into the long, ringing silence that follows a great storm, there came a sound that did not belong. It came from the door. 3 slow knocks, then nothing, then 3 more. Hannah lifted her head from her pallet. Cassie was already on her feet, ears up, but she did not bark. She only looked at Elias with the old steady look of a dog that has known her man a long time. Elias rose. He took the iron poker from beside the hearth, more from habit than from fear, and he walked the 4 short steps to the door. The knock came again, weaker this time. The sound of a hand that no longer had much strength left in it. He pulled back the oilcloth. He lifted the cowhide. He set his shoulder to the door and pushed, and the packed snow gave way at last, and a wedge of moonlight fell across the warm slate floor. And in the wedge of moonlight, on his knees in the snow, with his coat frozen stiff and his beard a sheet of ice and only one mitten on his ruined hand, was Henry Drummond, the blacksmith. Behind him, half carried and half dragged through the drifts, was Reverend Bell, and behind the Reverend, gray-faced and shaking, was Coleman Pratt, the saloon keeper, who had laughed loudest of all. Elias Carver did not speak. He stood in the low doorway for one long breath, and he looked at the 3 men who had laughed at him, and the 3 men looked back at him with eyes that had nothing left in them but the simple human need of warmth. Then he stepped aside. He opened the door the rest of the way. He took Henry Drummond by the elbow, gently, because he could see the ruined hand, and he helped him over the threshold onto the warm slate floor. He went back for Reverend Bell, who was nearly insensible, and he half carried the thin man inside and laid him by the hearth. He came back a 3rd time for Coleman Pratt, who was the largest of the 3 and the most ashamed, and who looked at the ground rather than at Elias's face as he stumbled through the low door. Hannah, 11 years old, did not say a word. She rose from her pallet. She poured hot water from the singing kettle into 3 tin cups. She crumbled the last of the cornbread into a wooden bowl and set it between them. She brought a folded blanket and laid it across the Reverend's shoulders. She did all of this with her mother's quiet and her mother's gray eyes, and her father watched her and felt a thing rise in his chest that he could not have named. The 3 men sat on the warm slate. They held their cups in hands that could barely close. They did not speak for a long time. It was Coleman Pratt who finally spoke. He looked at the curved wall of fitted river stones, lit gold by the small fire. He looked at the sod roof above his head. He looked at the warm floor beneath him. He looked, last, at Elias Carver, who was sitting on the edge of his daughter's pallet with his hands folded in his lap. "Elias," Pratt said. His voice was small. Elias raised one hand. Only a little, not in anger, in something gentler than that. "Drink your water, Coleman," he said. "The wind isn't done. You'll need your strength to walk home when it is." That was all he said. He did not say, "I told you so." He did not say, "You laughed." He did not name the saloon or the church step or the blacksmith's door. He said only that they would need their strength, and he poured another cup of water, and he set it down within Henry Drummond's reach. In the corner, Cassie put her head back down on her paws. The three men stayed 4 days. The storm came back on the second day, lighter than before but bitter enough to kill a man caught outside, and Elias would not let them leave. They slept on the warm slate, all of them, and Hannah read aloud from the thin book of Psalms in the evenings, because her father's voice had grown hoarse with the smoke. On the third day, Henry Drummond, with his ruined hand wrapped in clean linen, told the story of how he had come to find the shelter, how he had remembered, in the deepest hour of his own cold, the direction of Elias's bluff, and how he had set out with the Reverend and Pratt because there was no other place left to go. "The whole valley," he said, looking into the fire. "The whole valley is broken, Elias. Roofs down, animals dead. The bell girl—" He stopped. He looked at the Reverend, who had not yet spoken of his wife, and he did not finish the sentence. Elias only nodded. On the fifth morning the sky opened, blue and clean and cold, and the three men walked out of the small stone dome into a world that was nothing like the one they had walked in from. They went back down the slope toward what was left of Bitter Hollow, and they took with them 3 loaves of cornbread Hannah had wrapped in clean cloth, and they did not look back until they had crossed the river ice. And when they did look back, they did not laugh. Spring came late that year. It came in early April, slow and uncertain, with the river breaking up in long groaning slabs of green-white ice. The cottonwoods along the bank put out their tight red buds. The first crocus came up on the south side of the bluff, by the warm slate floor that had stored a winter's worth of small fires. Hannah found it on a morning in late April and brought her father out to see it. He knelt beside the flower. He did not pick it. He only looked at it for a long minute, and then he looked up at the curve of fitted stone that had carried them through the longest winter of their lives. Bitter Hollow was rebuilt that summer. Some men left. Most stayed. Henry Drummond built his new forge with a low, rounded back wall of river stone, set without mortar, and he did not need to be asked why. Reverend Bell preached a sermon in May that no one ever forgot, though no one could ever quite remember the words. Only that the Reverend wept twice, and that he spoke for a long time about the difference between the wisdom of the marketplace and the wisdom of the quiet man. Coleman Pratt did not rebuild the saloon. He took up carpentry instead, badly at first, and then less badly, and he was sometimes seen, in the long evenings, walking up to the bluff to sit a while on a stump near the stone dome, and say nothing at all to the man who lived inside it. Elias Carver lived in the stone refuge for the rest of his life. Hannah grew up there. She married a young rancher named Tom Whitfield in the spring of 1894, and she had 3 children of her own, and she taught each of them, before they could read, how to lay a river stone so that it would not move. The dome still stands today, they say, on a curve of the Powder River, in a place that used to be called Bitter Hollow, and is now not called anything at all. The roof has been patched. The hearth has been relaid. But the 743 stones Elias Carver carried up from the river in the autumn of 1887 are still in their places, fitted by weight and by shape, locked by gravity and by the long patient memory of a man who once knelt in cold water and listened to a wisdom older than the country he stood in. The men in the valley had said it was madness. By spring, it was the only thing left standing. On the frontier, wisdom wasn't the loudest voice in the room. It was the quiet stone that held the heat long after the fire had gone out. If this story stayed with you, the next one is already waiting.